Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for almost 50 years. He went down in history as the most fiery orator. His longest speech lasted 7 hours, and more than 600 attempts were made on his life. He came to power as a fighter against dictatorship under the slogan of democracy. However, just a couple of months later, he became a dictator himself. In the first years of Castro's rule, Cuba was hit by the largest economic sanctions in world history. In the Soviet Union, Cuba was called the Island of Freedom, although in reality it was a poor country strangled by sanctions in which history stopped forever. Where history had stopped forever, Fidel Alejandro Castro was born in the village of Biran in Oriente province in eastern Cuba. The official date of Castro's birth is August 13, 1926. Although in fact he was born a year later, parents changed the year of birth to send his son to elementary school at the age of 5. His father, Angel Castro, was a poor Spanish peasant. In search of a better life, he went to Cuba. At the time, the country had just gained independence from Spain. He became the owner of a large sugar plantation. Fidel Castro's mother, Lee Narus Gonzalez, was a cook on his father's estate and had 5 children with Angel before he married her. Despite the fact that Fidel Castro's parents were uneducated, they were able to give all their children a good education. Interest in politics Castro began to show even in childhood. For example, it is known that in 1940, he wrote a letter to the then American President Franklin Roosevelt. In the letter, he congratulated the president on his re-election to a 3rd term and asked, "If it is difficult for you to send us a letter of congratulations," congratulated the president on his re-election for a 3rd term and asked, "If it is not difficult to send me, please send me an American $10 bill. I've never seen it, but I would like to have it very much. Your friend." In the return address line, he gave the coordinates of the school he attended. Strangely enough, Fidel received a reply from the presidential administration, but without the coveted banknote. From the memories of contemporaries in his youth, Fidel Castro fought a lot and always carried a gun. Once, he crashed his bicycle into a wall on a dare. After school, Castro entered the privileged Jesuit College of Belen and graduated with honors in 1945. After graduating, he moved and educated to a number of colleges in the U.S., but grew tired of the classes. And when he did graduate, he entered the Faculty of Law. As a student, Castro read a lot. Mostly it was the works of Mussolini, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, José Martí, and Mein Kampf, Hitler. To the communists, at that time, he had no sympathy and even once joked that, "I am ready to become a communist immediately if they make me Stalin." During his university years, the Cuban students then played a significant political role and acted as a full-fledged opposition. Castro, in particular, organized large rallies against the corrupt government of the then Cuban president Grausin Martino, and known for his ties with criminal gangs. In 1952, there was a coup d'état in Cuba, and Fulgencio Batista seized power. Soon, the Cuban Congress was dissolved and legislative power was transferred to the Council of Ministers. For a month and a half, the constitutional guarantees were suspended. The Constitution of the 40th year was soon abolished. Fidel Castro was in the forefront of the struggle against the Batista regime. He prepared a lawsuit against the usurper in court, which provided evidence. Castro stated in court that Batista should immediately be sentenced to 100 or more years in prison. Manifesto of Fidel Castro had no positive consequences. However, Gradually, around the young politician began to form a large circle of supporters. Soon, Castro and his associates began to prepare a plan to overthrow Batista. It was decided to storm the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. It was believed that if the second largest fortress in Cuba fell, it would put psychological pressure on Batista's supporters and raise the spirit of the protesters. However, the assault failed and Fidel Castro was arrested. At the military tribunal, Castro made his famous speech, "History will vindicate me," in which he sharply condemned the Batista regime and called the Cuban people to armed struggle against tyranny. On September 21, 1953, the court sentenced Fidel Castro to 15 years in prison. But the Batista regime was not so bloodthirsty. In prison, Castro spent only 22 months and was released under the general amnesty of the Moncadistas. In the same year, Fidel Castro emigrated to Mexico, where he began to organize a new uprising. On November 25, 1956, on the motor yacht Grandma, Fidel Castro and his associates went to Cuba to make the revolution. You just listen to this monologue to find out more about native terrestrials in the United States. The 18-meter diesel yacht was designed for 12 people. However, 82 people were on board. The ship moved into the Caribbean Sea at a speed of 7.2 knots. As a result, the entire crew became seasick, and among the passengers was Argentine physician Ernesto Che Guevara, who described the situation as the whole ship was a real tragedy. Men with a longing look on their faces were holding their stomachs. Some just plunged their faces into buckets. Others sat motionless in strange poses with their clothes covered in vomit. The landing on the coast of Cuba was also unsuccessful. Many of the ship's passengers were killed or captured. At first, Castro and his fighters posed no serious threat to the Batista regime. They could only carry out isolated operations, attacking police stations. But gradually, the movement began to gain strength. By 1957, Fidel Castro's detachments numbered already several hundred people. However, to suppress them seemed to be not difficult. Batista had several thousand armed soldiers at his disposal. However, the unexpected happened. When Batista moved his army to suppress the rebels, most of them scattered or went over to the side of the revolutionaries. The revolution began to gain momentum. Guerrilla detachments of Castro were transformed into a rebel army. Commander-in-Chief, who became Fidel Castro January 1, 1959. The rebel army entered Havana. Batista was defeated and the formation of a new government was announced. On the same day, immediately after the overthrow of Batista, the revolutionaries began to form a new government. Manuel Urrutia became interim president. Liberal lawyer Miru Cardona became prime minister. Fidel Castro was appointed minister of war. As the guerrilla war. During the guerrilla war, Castro told reporters that he was not interested in power, particularly in an interview with Herbert Matthews of the New York Times. He said, "I am not interested in power. After the victory, I will return to my village and do law practice." However, in fact, everything happened exactly the opposite. On February 15th, Prime Minister Miru Cardona resigns, and the new head of government is Fidel Castro. Initially, Fidel Castro had the support of a huge majority of up to 98% of the country's population. But from the first few months, the situation began to change rapidly. Earlier, Castro repeatedly stated that he was not a communist, but became clearly pro-communist policy. The Cuban Revolution was carried out under democratic anti-dictatorial slogans. However, the group of people who came to power quickly concentrated power in their hands and became a dictatorship, not only political position, but also all independent public organizations and movements, including trade unions, were liquidated. Strict censorship was established, dissent was persecuted. Even revolutionary dissent. A militia of thousands was created to suppress dissent. Initially, it was announced that only war criminals functionaries of the Batista regime would be tried. On January 12, 1959, a show trial was organized for 72 policemen connected with the Batista regime, all of whom were shot. The turning point was the first law of agrarian reform. On May 17, 1959, a new law came into force according to which land plots of more than 400 hectares were to be seized from the owners and divided among the peasants. However, the wealthy landowners were against such forced collectivization and considered it as a robbery. As a result, a mass peasant uprising broke out, which soon turned into a new guerrilla war that lasted for several years. As a result, the militias were brutally suppressed by the government army. Another escalation of repression in Cuba came after the so-called Ilentarias. The so-called Operation in the Valley of the Pigs, or Operation in the Bay of Cachinos, was an attempt to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro with the help of the CIA. However, after the operation, not only all its participants were arrested, but also lists of unreliable people were compiled, so many of them that stadiums and other public places were converted to create concentration camps. In the 60s, on the island of Liberty, were shot, according to different estimates, from 7,000 to 10,000 people, and the number of prisoners amounted to 30,000. By order of Castro in Cuba, was created a system of camps which existed in Cuba. A system of camps that existed from 65 to 68. One could get into these camps for such offenses as drinking, drug addiction, vagrancy, homosexuality, excessive religiosity, or even listening to imperialist rock and roll. This category of criminals was called rockeros. People in the camps were kept in inhuman conditions. People were forced to work in their underwear, and the guilty were forced to cut the grass with their own teeth. Prisoners were also immersed in cesspools for several hours. Cuba also had, and still has, high-security camps, where the power is in the hands of prisoners themselves. According to calculations by American human rights groups, the Castro regime threw into prisons and concentration camps 3 times as many political prisoners as Hitler and Stalin did at the same time. At one stage, 1,000,000 people from all walks of life were imprisoned for political reasons at the same time. In comparison, during the Batista regime, there were 500 political prisoners in Cuba, and under the dictatorship of Gerardo Machado, about 5,000. Many prisoners were serving sentences of 20, 30 years or life imprisonment. Thousands of opponents of the regime were beaten, tortured, locked in cramped cells where it was impossible to sit or lie down. According to the Black Book of Communism, published in Harvard, the regime shot 14,000 people aged 16 to 68 years old. According to the Freedom House organization, a total of 500,000 Cubans passed through the system of camps and torture chambers during the years of the Castro regime. By the early 1960s, virtually every sector of Cuba's economy was growing thanks to U.S. private investment, from Roma cigars and sugar to shipbuilding, engineering, and electronics. After coming to power, Castro decided to nationalize the property of American citizens and signed a decree to that effect. Under the nationalization fell both large companies and ordinary U.S. citizens unfortunate enough to have bought a house or land plot in Cuba. Castro motivated his decision by saying that capitalism has no moral and ethical values. Everything is for sale. It is impossible to educate people properly in such conditions. People become selfish and sometimes even gangsters. This event divided the history of Cuba into before and after the U.S. reaction followed immediately. Cuba was declared an embargo on the supply of any goods to the country except food and medicines, not complying with it. The United States threatened countries and companies with sanctions and the breakdown of relations. In 1962, John F. Kennedy signed an executive order on a complete trade embargo. Then Cuba was excluded from the Organization of American States and was completely cut off from all trade routes. The situation was aggravated by the Caribbean crisis. The USSR placed missiles with nuclear warheads in Cuba. Thanks to the friendship with the Soviet Union, the Cuban economy managed to stay afloat. The USSR annually provided Cuba with about $3 billion of aid, bought overpriced rum, cane sugar, and tobacco, and supplied basic necessities. However, the era of world socialism was coming to an end by the end of the 1980s. The Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba faced the most difficult times. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost 185% of its trade ties. In just a few years, from 1989 to 1993, the country's GDP fell by almost 40%. Foreign technical specialists who supported its industry began to leave the country. In particular, 7,000 Soviet specialists left Cuba. In addition, in 1992, the U.S. further tightened its sanctions policy and banned money transfers to Cuba. If earlier emigrants from Cuba could transfer currency to their relatives and somehow replenish the country's reserve, this flow has stopped. Since 1962 in Cuba was introduced a card system, which has not been cancelled until now. The system of distribution of goods on cards has been repeatedly changed and improved. Since birth, each citizen of Cuba is assigned to a store in the place of residence. Each citizen receives a monthly food ration from the state, which includes 3 kilograms of rice, half a kilogram of beans, a kilogram of pasta, 2 kilograms of sugar, a bottle of soybean oil, half a kilogram of coffee, a dozen eggs, salt, chicken meat, fish, and a stick of sausage. Also, the state provides Cubans with coal, kerosene, or gas cylinders, depending on the type of stove in the home. However, these measures did not help to cope with the global economic crisis. The country was constantly cut off electricity due to lack of resources. Epidemics broke out every now and then. Because there were simply no medicines, child mortality increased. Nevertheless, the elderly commander remained adamant. Even when all the countries of the socialist camp were forced to recognize the failure of their economies, Fidel Castro did not want to change his beliefs for any other. Especially since all these economic problems did not affect Castro personally. In 2006, Forbes magazine ranked the 10 richest kings and dictators. In this list, among others, was the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The publication then estimated the state of the commander in $900 million. Fidel Castro was extremely outraged by such calculations and was even going to sue the publication. He said that all this is slander and that he lives on 900 pesos a month minus $43 like many of his compatriots, and that all his real estate is a fisherman's hut and an apartment in Havana. However, in 2014, the book The Double Life of Fidel Castro was published. The reaction to this book had a bombshell effect. The author of this book, Juan Reynaldo Sanchez, is a former bodyguard of the commander who served him for 17 years. The commander was God to me. I was always ready to die for him. But everything changed when I once heard him talking to Colombian drug traffickers. These are the words that begin the book. In 2008, Sanchez fled Cuba for Mexico and from there moved to the United States. In his book, the former commander-in-command wrote that Castro ruled the country as his own fiefdom and was something between a medieval lord and Louis XV. Sanchez also noted that Fidel's lifestyle was one that ordinary citizens of the island of freedom could not have imagined. Contrary to what he always claimed, Fidel never gave up capitalist comforts. The former bodyguard wrote that the commander woke up late and did not get to work until noon after a moderate breakfast. His favorite movie was War and Peace by Sergei Bondarchuk, which the commander watched many times. Advantage over the rum produced in his own country, Castro gave Scotch whiskey, which he drank with a few pieces of ice. Cigars really smoked his Cuban, and in a box under them stored angle and diamonds, which reminded Sanchez of a pirate of the Caribbean Sea. According to Sanchez, in the ownership of Fidel Castro was about 20 luxury real estate. One of them is a private island, Cayo Piedra, located south of the Bay of Pigs. Here the commander received dear guests such as the writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, with whom he spent time spearfishing. Also on a tropical island, Castro had a turtle farm and a personal dolphinarium. Luxury real estate was at Castro and in the Cuban capital. In the estate in Havana, to the services of the commander was equipped and medical center, basketball court, bowling on the roof, and a private pier. Fidel Castro reached his own island on a private yacht called Aquarama II. It was finished in precious wood from Angola. And the high speed was powered by 4 engines. According to a former bodyguard, the yacht was a gift to the commander of the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Cars on which moved Castro also often were gifts from the USSR, but in contrast to the yachts of the commander, was not particularly interested in cars. In April 1963, during a visit to the Soviet Union, Castro visited the plant named after Lekachev. There he was presented on behalf of Nikita Khrushchev Open ZIL 111, which reached Cuba by September of the same year. In the USSR, it was one of the first cars with an automatic gearbox. As an everyday, Castro used another Soviet car, Army SUV Gaz-69, but there were in the garage of the commander and foreign cars. As Juan Sanchez writes in his book, Castro always traveled with his entourage. He was accompanied by at least 10 guards, 2 personal blood donors, and in the legs of the Cuban leader held a loaded gun. The whole world remembered Fidel Castro as a man in a military kittle of dark green color and in a cap with a wide visor. In his old age, his favorite was a tracksuit, but underneath Castro's modest clothes there was room for expensive accessories. In 1963, during a visit to the USSR, the Cuban leader wore 2 pairs of Rolex watches on his wrist, and some reporters speculated that one showed Russian time and the other Cuban time. Judging by archival photos, Castro had an extensive collection of Rolex watches, but one of the favorites of the Cuban leader was the Submariner model, in which the commander is pictured in a 1959 Life magazine photo on the balcony of the Hilton Hotel after the rebel armies had triumphed. After the rebel armies triumphantly entered Havana, Fidel Castro entered the Guinness Book of Records for 2 reasons at once. First, as the most fiery orator. His speech before the United Nations on September 26th, 60th year, lasted 4 hours and 29 minutes, but it was not his longest speech. At the 3rd Congress of the Cuban Communist Party in 1986, Fidel Castro spoke for 7 hours and 10 minutes. Castro holds the 2nd world record for the number of attempts on his life. Sanchez's bodyguard claims there were about 200. However, it is believed there were more than 600 attempts on Castro's life. On British television was shown a documentary film, 638 Ways to Kill Castro. The film reveals the many attempts to kill Castro, in the course of went poisoned cigarettes, scuba diving with tubercle bacillus in cylinders, bombs and baseball swords, syringe pens, and much more. Behind all these attempts were both the U.S. government and the Cuban opposition. In addition, Castro hated American mafia groups. After coming to power, the commander took over Havana's famous casinos and brothels. However, Castro was unusually lucky and did not suffer from any of the attempts. He himself once said, "If the ability to survive an assassination attempt was an Olympic discipline, I would have a gold medal in it." Fidel Castro died of natural causes at the age of 90 on November 25, 2016, outliving most of those who planned his elimination.